The events of that night continue to haunt me, leaving me in a state of uncertainty each time I reflect on them. I find myself torn between viewing it as a regrettable mistake or cherishing it as an exhilarating memory. Allow me to recount the circumstances that led to this dilemma. The evening commenced like many others in our home, characterized by a tranquil atmosphere occasionally disrupted by the soft clinking of glassware or the muted sounds of the television. My wife, Mary, had returned from one of her lengthy trips earlier that day. She scarcely touched her dinner before pouring herself a drink and sinking into the couch. Meanwhile, I occupied myself in the kitchen, tidying up the remnants of our meal, my hands engaged in scrubbing a plate while my thoughts drifted elsewhere. Although Mary's presence was familiar, it offered little solace. She was not unkind, but rather emotionally absent. Over time, her lack of engagement had become a persistent reality, even when she was physically present. It was at that moment I heard soft, deliberate footsteps approaching from the hallway. I turned to see Daniel, my 20-year-old stepson, standing in the doorway. His hair was slightly disheveled, and his expression conveyed a mix of curiosity and caution as he glanced between me and the living room. "Hey," he said, his voice low to avoid waking his mother. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I replied, managing a small smile. "Just cleaning up." He nodded and stepped further into the room. "Mom's already had a few, huh?" I responded with a knowing look. "You could say that," I confirmed. Daniel sighed, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. There was something noticeably different about him that evening, an intensity in his gaze that quickened my heartbeat. He had matured significantly since I first met him, evolving from an awkward teenager into a self-assured young man, a transformation I could not overlook, despite my efforts to remain detached. "Are you staying up late tonight?" he inquired, breaking the silence. "I'm not sure," I replied with a shrug. "Maybe you should get some rest," he suggested thoughtfully. "You've been doing everything around here." While Mother has been doing well, I chuckled softly, appreciating his concern. "I am fine, Daniel," I reassured him. He gave me a look that suggested he was not entirely convinced but opted not to pursue the matter further. Instead, he moved to fetch a glass of water, and the small kitchen suddenly felt a bit cramped with both of us present. Mary's voice broke the silence, loud and slurred from the other room. "Frank, could you please bring me another drink?" Daniel's jaw tightened as he glanced toward the living room. I placed a hand on his arm, offering silent reassurance that I had the situation under control. "I'll take care of it," I said softly. He nodded, his gaze lingering on mine for a moment longer than necessary before stepping aside to allow me to pass. I retrieved a fresh glass, filling it with Mary's preferred whiskey, and carried it to her, setting it on the side table with a practiced smile. "Thanks, sweetheart," she said, already turning her attention back to the screen. I returned to the kitchen, finding Daniel still there, his posture now more relaxed. "She'll probably fall asleep soon," I remarked, attempting to lighten the mood. "Yeah," Daniel replied, smirking, "let's hope so." We shared a quiet laugh, the tension easing slightly. However, as silence enveloped us again, I felt his gaze on me, steady and unwavering. It was not the casual glance of a stepson toward his stepfather, it was something entirely different. My breath caught, and my pulse quickened as I turned to meet his eyes. "Frank," he began, but whatever he intended to say was interrupted by the sound of Mary's soft snores emanating from the living room. We both froze, listening for a moment to confirm that she was indeed asleep. Daniel exhaled, shaking his head with a small laugh. "That didn't take long." "No, it didn't," I replied, my voice now quieter. The atmosphere in the room shifted, the silence thick with unspoken words. I busied myself with rearranging a dish towel, yet I could feel Daniel's presence behind me, solid and reassuring. "You don't have to do everything alone, you know," he said softly. I turned to face him. My brow slightly furrowed as I questioned, "What do you mean you take care of him in the house?" "But who takes care of you?" The question lingered in the air, heavy and poignant. I opened my mouth to respond, yet found myself without an answer. No one truly had one. Mary's work often took her away, and I had grown accustomed to fending for myself, relying on my own strength to endure the lonely nights. "I manage," I finally said, though the words felt empty. Daniel stepped closer, his expression earnest. You shouldn't have to. You deserve more than that. I looked up at him, startled by the intensity of his voice. There was a warmth and determination in his eyes that made my chest tighten. Daniel, I began, but the words faltered on my lips. Before I could articulate my thoughts, he reached out, brushing his hand against mine. The touch was brief yet electric, sending a jolt of something indescribable through me. Instinctively, I stepped back, the distance between us a mix of relief and loss. We should get some sleep, I suggested, my voice shaky. Yeah, he replied, though his gaze lingered on me a moment longer. Good night, Frank. Good night, I responded, watching him walk down the hallway toward his room. I remained there for a long time after he left, my mind racing with everything that had just transpired, his gaze, the lingering touch. It was overwhelming yet insufficient. I was uncertain of what to make of it, but one thing was evident, something had shifted between us, and change was imminent. Indeed, change would come sooner than I anticipated. That night, sleep eluded me. The house had fallen silent, save for the occasional snore from Mary in the living room, but my mind was anything but quiet. Daniel's words, his touch, the way he had looked at me replayed in my mind like an unending loop. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, attempting to will the thoughts away, but they remained stubbornly present. Eventually, I surrendered to the reality that sleep would not come. I rose from bed and quietly made my way down the hallway, the soft illumination from the living room lamp spilling into the corridor. I deliberately avoided glancing at Mary as I passed, not wishing to disturb her slumber. Instead, I proceeded to the kitchen, contemplating whether a glass of water might soothe my restless thoughts. As I stood by the sink, sipping from the glass and gazing out at the dark, tranquil street, I heard gentle footsteps approaching from behind. My heart raced as I turned to find Daniel standing in the doorway. He was dressed in a simple t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair still disheveled from sleep. He appeared to have just awakened, yet his eyes were wide awake, and his expression was uncertain. I couldn't sleep, he said in a low voice. Me neither, I admitted, placing the glass down. He stepped further into the kitchen, leaning against the counter. For a moment, we remained silent, the air between us thick with unspoken tension. I could feel his gaze upon me, the intensity of it causing my chest to tighten. Are you okay? He asked softly. I don't know, I replied candidly. I suppose I just have a lot on my mind. He nodded, his expression contemplative. Me too. I turned to face him fully, leaning back against the counter. What's on your mind? He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. He finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. The weight of his words lingered in the air, heavy and charged. My breath caught, and I stared at him, uncertain of how to respond. Part of me wanted to dismiss his statement, to attribute it to a fleeting moment of confusion or misplaced feelings. Yet another part of me, the part yearning for connection and intimacy, could not overlook the way his words quickened my heartbeat. Daniel, I began, but he stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. I mean it, he said, his voice now more assured. I've been thinking about you a lot, and I know it's wrong, but I can't help it. You're just confused, I replied hastily, though the words felt empty even as I spoke them. We've been spending more time together, and with your mom away so often, it's natural to feel this way. It is more than that, he stated, shaking his head. I have felt this way for some time, Frank, I just struggled to articulate it. His candidness rendered me speechless. I turned away, gripping the edge of the counter as I attempted to collect my thoughts. This situation was crossing a boundary, one we could not afford to blur. Yet, I could not dismiss the feelings his words evoked within me, a sense of being wanted, seen, and truly alive. You shouldn't feel that way, I finally managed to say, though my voice lacked conviction. I cannot control my feelings, he replied simply, but I can control my actions. I turned back to face him, searching his eyes for any sign of doubt, but found none. He regarded me with a steadiness that made my heart ache, as if urging me to see him not merely as my stepson, but as a man who genuinely cared for me. This is complicated, I said, my voice trembling. And your mother is passed out drunk in the living room, he interjected softly yet firmly. She is not here right now, it is just us. The truth of his statement struck me like a blow to the chest. It was indeed just the two of us, standing alone in the quiet kitchen, the rest of the world fading into the background. For the first time in a long while, I felt as though I was not bearing the weight of everything alone. "I don't know if I can do this," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine. "I do not wish to complicate things for you," he said, "but I needed you to understand how I feel." His touch was gentle yet electric, sending a shiver down my spine. I looked up at him, my heart racing as the space between us diminished. "Daniel," I began, but before I could say anything further, he leaned in, his lips softly brushing against mine in a tentative kiss. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I was frozen, torn between retreating and surrendering to the torrent of emotions within me. Then, something shifted. I felt my defenses crumble, the burden of my loneliness and yearning giving way to an undeniable force. I kissed him back, my hands instinctively moving toward him. As I surrendered to the moment, the kiss intensified, and the surrounding world began to dissolve. All that occupied my senses was him, his warmth, his presence, and the way he made me feel truly seen and understood, a sensation I had not experienced in years. When we finally separated, both of us were breathless, our foreheads touching as we attempted to regain our composure. "This cannot happen," I stated, though my tone lacked certainty. "I know," he replied, his voice unwavering, "but it already has." I gazed at him, my thoughts a tumult of emotions. A part of me yearned to push him away, to act as if this encounter had never occurred, while another part, weary of loneliness and invisibility, longed to cling to him and never let go. The moment hung heavily in the air, charged with unspoken tension. Daniel stood so near that I could feel his warmth enveloping me, his gaze unwavering. My heart raced, and my mind urged me to retreat, to restore some semblance of normalcy, yet my feet remained rooted in place. "Daniel," I began, my voice trembling, "we can't." He lifted his hand, his fingers gently caressing my cheek. "I know this is complicated," he said softly, "but I have never felt this way before, not with anyone." His words resonated deeply within me, echoing my own feelings of isolation and yearning. The boundaries we were navigating were evident, yet for the first time in years, I felt genuinely desired, truly, undeniably desired. I took a small step back, attempting to create distance, but Daniel mirrored my movements, his approach careful and intentional. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable," he said. "If you want me to stop, just say the word." The sincerity in his voice caused my heart to ache. I could see the conflict in his eyes, reflecting my own inner struggle. "This isn't fair," I protested, shaking my head, "to you, to me, to your mother." "I know," he replied, his voice barely a whisper, "but I cannot disregard how I feel, and I don't believe you can either." The weight of his words lingered in the air, undeniable and profound, as I continued to look at him. I examined his face for any hint of uncertainty, yet all I could discern was sincerity and a vulnerability that tugged at my heart. "This is so wrong," I whispered, more to myself than to him. Nevertheless, he stepped closer and replied, "It feels so right." His hand found mine, fingers intertwining in a gesture that was both simple and profoundly intimate, sending a shiver down my spine. I was acutely aware that I should withdraw, that every instinct urged me to leave the room and never look back. Yet, I remained firmly in place, ensnared by the magnetic allure of his presence. "Daniel," I said, my voice quivering, "I'm scared." "I am too," he confessed, "but I've never been more certain of anything in my life." His words acted as a catalyst, dismantling the barriers I had constructed around myself. Before I could reconsider, I leaned in, my lips grazing his in a tentative kiss. It began softly, hesitantly, as if we were both exploring the limits of this uncharted territory. But then it intensified, and the world around us faded into obscurity. His hands moved to my waist, drawing me closer as our kiss became more passionate. I could feel his heartbeat synchronizing with the rapid pulse of my own. My hands found their way to his shoulders, gripping him as if he were my only anchor. The faint creak of the floorboards in the living room jolted me back to reality. I pulled away, breathless and wide-eyed, my chest rising and falling as I tried to comprehend what had just transpired. "We can't do this," I stammered, my voice trembling. "Mary is just in the other room." Daniel stepped back slightly, his own breathing uneven. "I know," he said, running a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to push you." "It's not just you," I replied quickly, my thoughts a chaotic whirlwind. I'm just as much to blame, but it's dangerous. He nodded, his expression conflicted. The tension between us was nearly unbearable as we stood there in the dimly lit kitchen, the weight of our actions pressing heavily upon us. I wished to articulate my thoughts, to find the appropriate words to mend the situation, yet my mind remained devoid of ideas. You should go to bed, I finally suggested, my voice barely rising above a whisper. We can discuss this in the morning. Daniel hesitated, his eyes searching mine as if he had more to express, but ultimately he nodded, stepping back and making his way toward the hallway. Good night, Frank, he said softly. Good night, I replied, watching him disappear into his room. I lingered in the kitchen for an extended period after his departure, my thoughts racing. What had begun as a tranquil evening had transformed into an unforeseen circumstance, leaving me to question everything. The boundary we had crossed was irrevocable, and the weight of that realization pressed heavily upon me. The most unsettling aspect was that this was not the end, it was destined to recur, albeit in a different manner. The following morning, the house was enveloped in silence when I awoke. Mary was still slumbering on the couch, and Daniel's door remained shut. I made my way to the kitchen, the echoes of the previous night still swirling in my mind. As I sipped my coffee, I found myself replaying the events repeatedly, each detail indelibly marked in my memory. The sound of footsteps interrupted my thoughts, and I turned to see Daniel entering the kitchen. He appeared hesitant, his gaze flickering to mine before dropping to the floor. Morning, he said, his voice subdued. Morning, I replied, my heart racing. We stood in silence for a moment, the unspoken tension between us almost tangible. Finally, he looked up, his expression earnest. About last night. I interrupted him quickly, my voice firmer than I felt. We shouldn't discuss it. It was a mistake. It didn't feel like a mistake, he replied softly, his eyes locking onto mine. Daniel, we can't, I said, my voice trembling. This isn't right. Maybe not, he said, stepping closer, but it doesn't change how I feel. His words caused a pang in my chest, the raw honesty in his voice piercing through my defenses. I wanted to argue, to push him away, but the truth was that I could not deny my own feelings either. The most alarming realization struck me as Daniel's words lingered in the air, heavy and inescapable. I grasped my coffee mug tightly, as if it could tether me to reality, yet my thoughts were spiraling out of control. He stood before me, awaiting a response, his gaze unwavering. I could perceive the turmoil within him, a blend of hope and fear intertwined. Finally, I managed to speak, my voice quivering, Daniel, we need to put an end to this. We cannot allow it to progress any further. His jaw clenched, and he nodded, though his expression was far from accepting. I understand, he replied, his tone gentle yet infused with resolve, but that does not mean I can simply suppress my feelings. I know, I responded, my voice barely above a whisper, but this is perilous for both of us. He took a deliberate step closer, his movements slow and measured. Then tell me you don't feel the same way, he urged, his voice steady. Look me in the eye and say that last night meant nothing to you. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. I yearned to refute him, to assert that he was mistaken, yet the words eluded me. Deep down, I recognized the truth. The bond we had forged and the emotions that had surged between us were undeniably real. To deny it would be a falsehood we both understood. I can't, I confessed, my voice faltering, but that does not justify it. Perhaps not, he replied, stepping even closer, but it is the truth, and I believe that holds significance. His nearness quickened my heartbeat, prompting me to retreat, seeking space between us. Your mother is still here, I stated, my voice more resolute now. We cannot pursue this, not with her in the house. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. You are right, he conceded reluctantly, but this is not the end, Frank. We cannot simply act as if it never occurred. I averted my gaze, unable to withstand the intensity of his stare any longer. We will talk later, I said dismissively, but for now, we must concentrate on maintaining a sense of normalcy. He nodded, though the tension in his posture indicated his dissatisfaction. Okay, he said quietly, but I meant what I said. He turned and exited the kitchen, leaving me alone with my tumultuous thoughts. I sank into a chair, my hands shaking as I placed the mug down. The weight of our conversations and actions bore down on me, suffocating in its intensity. Then, one evening, it felt as though everything repeated itself. The night mirrored the previous one. Mary had poured herself a drink after dinner, followed by another, and yet another. By the time the television was airing its second rerun of an old sitcom, he lay sprawled on the couch, softly snoring. Although he was physically present, his presence felt as distant as ever. I busied myself around the house, tidying up the remnants of dinner while attempting to keep my mind occupied. The silence that enveloped the house as Mary succumbed to her drunken slumber was nearly deafening, amplifying the thoughts I struggled to suppress. Daniel soon emerged from his room, his steps careful and deliberate as he entered the kitchen. He glanced at the living room, a small, almost exasperated smile forming on his lips. "He's out again, isn't he?" I remarked, my voice tinged with more bitterness than I intended. Daniel leaned against the counter, crossing his arms as he observed me. "You shouldn't have to endure this." "It's nothing I'm not accustomed to," I replied with a shrug, though deep down, I recognized that it wasn't entirely accurate. The burden of loneliness had intensified over the years, and the rare moments when it lifted, like the previous night, were impossible to overlook. We stood in silence for a moment, the unspoken tension between us palpable and undeniable. I could feel his gaze on me, the intensity causing my pulse to quicken. "Daniel, we shouldn't." I began, but my voice faltered as he stepped closer. "I know," he said softly, his eyes searching mine. "But I can't help how I feel." His honesty left me breathless, and for a moment, I was at a loss for words. The boundaries we had worked so hard to re-establish felt fragile, ready to collapse at the slightest touch. When he reached for me, his fingers brushed against my skin. I felt the walls begin to crack against mine. "Daniel," I whispered, but before I could complete my thought, he closed the gap between us, his lips meeting mine in a kiss that was both tentative and filled with desire. I wanted to pull away, to halt this before it escalated further, yet the allure of his presence was overwhelming. The warmth of his hands on my back and the way he murmured my name against my lips made it impossible to resist. I surrendered to the moment, allowing the outside world to fade into obscurity. We moved cautiously and quietly from the kitchen to the sanctuary of my room, the door clicking softly behind us. For the first time in years, I felt the burden of loneliness lift, replaced by a sensation that resembled freedom. It was exhilarating, it was extraordinary, and it felt so wrong yet so right. I had almost forgotten the thrill of being with someone so young. I think we lost ourselves in each other 4, 5, or even 6 times, I lost track. The night was filled with whispered confessions and tentative caresses, each moment more intense than the last. The connection we had tried so hard to suppress became undeniable, and for those brief hours, nothing else mattered. It was reckless and perilous, yet in the stillness of the room, it felt like the only thing that made sense. As dawn began to break, casting a gentle light through the curtains, we lay side by side, the silence enveloping us with unspoken understanding. "We can't keep doing this," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know," he replied, though his tone carried a hint of reluctance. "But I don't regret it." Neither did I, though I couldn't voice it aloud. Instead, I rested my head against his shoulder, allowing the warmth of his presence to calm the chaos in my mind. For now, the outside world could wait. Surprisingly, the following day passed in a haze of normalcy, although the tension between Daniel and me lingered. He avoided Mary as much as possible, spending the majority of the day in his room, and I caught fleeting glimpses of him. His demeanor shifted, at times appearing distant and contemplative. Each instance caused my heart to constrict with a blend of guilt and yearning. After Mary retired for the night, I found myself aimlessly roaming the house. The silence was stifling, and my mind was a tumult of confusion and regret. Eventually, I settled in the living room, collapsing onto the couch and gazing vacantly at the television, though I was not truly watching. The sound of footsteps drew my attention, and I looked up to see Daniel in the doorway. He paused momentarily before entering, his expression a mix of caution and resolve. "Can we talk?" he inquired. I nodded, motioning for him to take a seat. He positioned himself at the far end of the couch, the distance between us feeling both excessive and insufficient simultaneously. "What's on your mind?" I asked, already anticipating his response. He hesitated, his eyes fixed on the floor. I don't want things to be awkward between us, he finally admitted, but I also don't want to act as if nothing occurred. I sighed, leaning back against the couch. Daniel, I'm unsure how to resolve this. What we did, what we felt, cannot simply be ignored, yet we cannot continue down this road either. I don't want to lose you, he said, his voice soft yet sincere. You're the one person who has always been there for me. You're not going to lose me, I reply firmly, but we must establish boundaries. This cannot happen again. He nodded slowly, though his expression revealed inner conflict. I'll try, he said, but it won't be easy. I understand, I whispered, but it's the only way. We remained in silence for an extended period, the tension palpable yet not intolerable. Eventually, Daniel rose, his movements slow and deliberate. Good night, Frank, he said quietly. Good night, I responded, watching him exit the room. Yet, something in his eyes suggested that this was not the end, that something more awaited us. Later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I could not shake the feeling. I replayed the events of the last 2 days in my mind. The bond between Daniel and me was unmistakable, yet the repercussions of crossing that boundary were too significant to overlook. I reassured myself that we could move beyond it, that with time, the tension would dissipate and life would return to its usual rhythm. However, deep down, I harbored doubts. The night lingered on, a heavy stillness enveloping the house as I lay in bed, the weight of everything pressing heavily upon me. Sleep eluded me, my thoughts spiraling in an unending cycle of guilt, yearning, and confusion. I convinced myself that this turmoil would eventually fade, that the feelings Daniel and I had acknowledged would diminish with time, yet the uncertainty gnawed at me relentlessly. A faint sound disrupted the silence, pulling me from my reverie. I sat up, straining to listen, and heard it again, soft, tentative footsteps in the hallway. My heart raced as the door creaked open slightly, the dim light from the corridor spilling into the room. Frank, Daniel's voice emerged, barely above a whisper. I hesitated for a moment before responding, my voice trembling. What is it? I couldn't sleep, he admitted, stepping into the room. He appeared anxious, his hands buried deep in his pockets, his gaze darting between me and the floor. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. Daniel, you shouldn't be here. I know, he replied quickly, urgency lacing his tone, but I just needed to talk to you. I glanced toward the closed door, my heart racing. Mary was just down the hall, asleep in the guest room after another evening of excess. The risk of being discovered sent a surge of adrenaline through me, yet I found it impossible to send Daniel away. Come in, I said softly, shifting to create space on the bed. He hesitated for a moment before crossing the room and sitting beside me. The mattress dipped under his weight, and the sudden proximity quickened my pulse. He looked at me, his expression a blend of vulnerability and resolve. I can't stop thinking about what happened, he confessed. The voice was barely audible as I began to express how it felt to be with you, Daniel, but he interrupted me. I know it's wrong, he said hastily. I understand we can't, but I can't help it, you're all I think about. His words struck me like a tidal wave, and I fought to maintain my composure. We can't do this, I replied, my voice quivering. It's too overwhelming. Then why does it feel so right, he inquired, his gaze intense. Why does everything seem to make sense when I'm with you? I turned my gaze away, unable to meet his eyes any longer. Because we're both lonely, I finally admitted, and we're mistaking that loneliness for something it isn't. Maybe, he suggested, leaning in closer, or perhaps we're just afraid to confront the truth. The atmosphere in the room felt constricted, thick with tension. I could sense the warmth emanating from him, a magnetic pull that was difficult to resist. He reached out, his fingers lightly brushing against mine, and the contact sent a shiver coursing through me. Daniel, we can't, I insisted, though my tone lacked certainty. Just one last time, he murmured softly, and then I'll let it go, I promise. I stared at him, my heart racing, every logical part of me urging me to refuse, to halt this before it escalated. Yet the ache in his voice and the desperation in his eyes reflected my own feelings, and in that moment, I found myself unable to pull away. Okay, I whispered, the word escaping my lips before I could reconsider. His eyes widened slightly, as if my agreement had taken him by surprise, but then he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was both gentle and filled with profound longing. I surrendered to the embrace, my hands weaving through his hair as the world around us faded into oblivion. The kiss deepened, and I felt his arms encircle me, drawing me closer as if he could not tolerate any distance between us. It was electric, a rush of emotions and sensations that left me breathless. I clung to him, losing myself in the moment, relinquishing everything but the bond we shared. Yet, just as swiftly as it had begun, reality came crashing back. I withdrew, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I gazed at him with wide eyes. We cannot continue like this, I stated, my voice trembling. I know, he replied, his own breath uneven, but I do not regret it. I turned my gaze away, my mind a tumult of thoughts. We must end this for good, I insisted. He nodded slowly, his face reflecting deep sadness. The silence that enveloped us was palpable as he rose, his movements hesitant. He paused at the door, casting one last glance back at me. Good night, Frank, he said softly. Good night, I responded, my voice barely a whisper. The days that followed were fraught with tension and unexpressed feelings. Daniel and I made a concerted effort to avoid being alone together, while I immersed myself in my daily routine, attempting to erase the events that had transpired. Yet, no matter how hard I tried, the memory persisted, a constant reminder of the boundary we had crossed. Mary remained unaware, her time at home consumed by her usual habits of drinking and trivial pursuits. The chasm between Daniel and me widened, leaving me to ponder how we had arrived at this juncture, ensnared in a marriage that felt more like a duty than a partnership. Daniel's demeanor also changed, he became increasingly withdrawn, his once carefree attitude replaced by a somber seriousness. I yearned to speak with him, to find a way to mend our relationship, but I was at a loss for how to begin. One evening, while tidying up after dinner, Daniel approached me in the kitchen. I think I need to spend some time at my mother's, he said, his voice steady yet laced with sorrow. I froze, my heart sinking at his words. Are you certain? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. Yes, I believe it is for the best. I wanted to protest, to convince him that he need not leave, but deep down, I recognized the truth in his words. Distance seemed to be the only path toward healing the wounds we had inflicted upon ourselves and each other. When are you leaving? I inquired, my chest tightening. Tomorrow, he replied. I have already spoken to my mother. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I will miss you. I will miss you too, he said softly as he turned away, leaving me with a regret and yearning enveloped me, yet I understood that parting ways was the necessary decision, regardless of the pain it caused. As I stood in the stillness of the kitchen, I murmured a silent farewell, wishing for a future where we could both attain the peace we sought. The weeks that followed were a tumultuous haze of emotions. Daniel and I made every effort to avoid one another, though the tension in the house was unmistakable. Mary, as oblivious as ever, continued her daily routine of work, drinking, and filling the space with her gruff demeanor. If she sensed any discord between us, she chose to remain silent. I occupied myself primarily in the kitchen or with household tasks, attempting to distract my mind, but the memories of that night persisted, replaying in my thoughts like a vivid dream, the way Daniel had gazed at me, the quiet vulnerability in his voice, and the undeniable bond we had shared felt intensely real and raw. One afternoon, while folding laundry, Daniel appeared in the doorway, his demeanor hesitant and his hands buried in his pockets. We need to talk, he said softly. I nodded, setting the laundry aside. We took our seats at the dining table, the silence between us stretching like a chasm. I could see the turmoil in his eyes as he struggled to articulate his thoughts. I've been reflecting on what transpired, he began, about us. Daniel, we can't, I started, but he interrupted, shaking his head. I know, he replied quickly. I know it can't happen again, but I don't regret it. His candidness left me momentarily speechless, and I gazed at him, uncertain of how to reply. Daniel, I finally managed, my voice quivering, what we did was a mistake. It was reckless, and it's not a foundation for a future. He averted his gaze, his jaw tightening. I understand, he said quietly, but that doesn't mean I can simply ignore what happened. We must, I insisted firmly, for your sake, for mine, and for Mary's. What we did does not define who we are. He nodded slowly, though his expression remained troubled. Conflicted, I found myself at a loss for how to progress from this situation. He confessed that he was uncertain about how to look at me without feeling the weight of our shared history. I responded, my voice softening, that it would take time, but eventually, we both would find a way to heal. The silence that enveloped us was thick, yet it carried a mutual understanding that this was the only path forward. Eventually, Daniel rose, his movements slow and measured. I think I need some space, he stated, suggesting that perhaps it was time for him to stay with his mother for a while. His words struck me like a blow to the chest, yet I nodded in agreement, recognizing the truth in his statement. If that is what you need, I replied, maintaining a steady voice despite the ache in my heart. I will call your mom tonight. He informed me that he would let her know he would be leaving the following morning. The next day, Daniel packed his belongings, and his absence left a void in the house that felt nearly unbearable. Mary seemed largely unaffected, brushing it off with a dismissive remark about kids needing their space before returning to her drink. As I observed Daniel's car departing from the driveway, I experienced a blend of relief and sorrow. We had made the right decision to create distance between us, allowing time to mend the wounds we had caused ourselves and each other. However, the pain of letting go was sharper than I had anticipated, serving as a stark reminder of how deeply we had crossed boundaries. In the weeks that followed, I concentrated on reconstructing my life, attempting to repair the fractures in my marriage and regain a sense of normalcy. Daniel and I exchanged courteous texts occasionally, sharing updates about school, work, and life in general, but the intimacy we once had was replaced by a respectful distance. I reassured myself that this was for the best and the only way forward. Gradually, the burden of that night began to lighten, though it never fully vanished. It lingered in quiet moments, a reminder of the choices we had made and the limits we had breached. Yet, life continued, as it invariably does, and although the scars from that night remained, they became an integral part of my narrative, a testament to the errors I had committed and the resilience it required to move forward. As I have previously stated, I remain uncertain about my feelings regarding this situation. Have you ever encountered a decision where your emotions and rational thoughts were in conflict? I would appreciate hearing your insights, as your perspective may assist me in gaining clarity. Thank you.